Hello. This is Derek from Wonderful Tea and Tao Teaware. Welcome back to another episode of Tea Soup, a podcast all about tea culture, life in modern China, and Chinese tea. I'm your host, Derek Poskin. I've been living in China since 2016, and I've been drinking, buying, and selling Chinese tea for the past decade. So, pop on that kettle, heat up your teaware, and let's get this session started. Alright, so here in China, tea season has officially begun. As I mentioned, in this Jiangnan region, that's the area of Hangzhou, Suzhou, Jiangsu in my area, and Zhejiang, the southern reaches of the Yangtze, the Jiangnan region. This is the green tea basket of China. This is where a lot of this stuff originated. Of course, Anhui is really next door, and that's the Huangshan Maofeng and the Taiping Hokui. And so this region produces some of China's greatest green teas. And this year, because of the climate, because of the weather, everything was a little late. As we mentioned, the awakening of the insects usually happens right around the 7th of March, and then you get the spring equinox. Spring equinox is usually like March 20th or March 22nd or something like that. This year, usually what happens is the green tea starts popping off right around like the 15th, the 14th of March, sometimes as early as the awakening of the insects, but it usually doesn't happen that early. This year, however, it didn't really start until right around the spring equinox, and so it was almost a full week late when you look at it based on last year and the years before. As a result, the tea season this year, everyone's a little anxious. The people that are making the tea, they're frantically trying to, pick tea early, make tea, because if you're selling Mingqian teas, you have until, April 5th, like that's the Qingming festival, to sell a huge amount of teas. And, you can only sell as much as you pick and as much as you make, but the market for this is huge here. Everyone wants the Mingqian teas. And so the farmers kind of feel a little limited. I mentioned this in the last episode where I feel like these teas are better than last year's, but for the farmers, it's the same problem as last year's. Last year was raining so much, and so they couldn't make so much tea. This year it was too cold, so they couldn't make as much tea as well. Anyways, I just got back from Hangzhou, and so I'm really excited to do this episode today and kind of talk about my experience in Hangzhou because it's all really fresh in my mind. And every time I visit Hangzhou, I come out with a deeper understanding of the whole region. This is my fourth, maybe fifth time visiting Hangzhou. The first time was before I really started sourcing this Longjing tea, and I was just going there to walk in the fields, touch some tea leaves, experience the culture a little bit. And I did that in December. And in December, this is back in like 2016, 2017. In December in the tea fields, a lot of the tea flowers are still blooming because the tea flowers bloom in autumn and then they kind of stick around for a long time. And so I remember walking around the mountains with this frost covering everything, and the tea flowers were all out. So there was the white tea flowers, frost on all of the tea bushes. Everything had been cut back after the spring harvest, and so it was all beautifully manicured. And if you ever get the chance to go out to Hangzhou, do it and walk around the West Lake, because in the West Lake region, there are just paved little staircases and paths that wander all through the ridges of the Longjing Mountains. I remember walking up through a bunch of bamboo groves last time I went to Hangzhou from the Running Tiger Spring. Walked all the way to like the crest of the ridge, and then you can kind of follow the ridge of the mountains around to the Mandrelong, to the Shifeng, to the Longjingcun. And I'll talk about my time there this year, because I have a deeper understanding of these different villages and of these different regions. But the first time I went there, I was just enjoying the atmosphere. And I remember meeting people that were doing their morning walks. I remember visiting the Running Tiger Spring. And I even bought some Dragonwell. This is like in December, and so it wasn't like the best stuff. But it was enough to get me interested in this whole idea, like maybe I should come back here and source this stuff for real. However, Dragonwell is one of those teas where the more you know, the more you wish you didn't know, because it's probably the most faked tea in China. And faked, I mean, it's tea that is made from outside the region, and then they say it's from that region. They make it to look like Dragonwell. They might even use the same exact cultivar. Like in Hubei, we have a whole lot of the Dragonwell number 43 cultivar planted in the Hubei fields. And I remember buying some Dragonwell from them that they make it in their Maojian style. And it's cool. It tastes really good, but they're like, yeah, it's technically Dragonwell. And it's like, well, is it Dragonwell if it doesn't come from, the Dragonwell village? This is a champagne question, but the thing is, the core region for the Dragonwell is so small, and it can only produce so much, but the market for Dragonwell is just absolutely massive. If you're really interested in the history, when I break down the exact amount of like the yield and the sizes and the demand for Dragonwell, these are Tea Soup episodes 11 to 15. And I get really into the history, the sourcing, the making of it all. In this episode, I'm just kind of talking about my recent experiences in the Dragonwell village and in this Westlake area. And I'll talk about this a little later. I met Jorgen from Tea Addicts, and he said that his old partner, Stefan, had tried to source Dragonwell before and spent some time in the Westlake area and just gave up. He was like, it's too difficult. And it was funny because I was talking to Jorgen, I was like, I understand. I totally understand, and I agree with Stefan because I had the same feeling. But it's ridiculous because you go into the Westlake area, you go into these Dragonwell villages, and you can't throw a rock without hitting a tea house. You can't look in any direction without seeing somebody selling tea. How can this possibly be difficult to buy tea when literally every single household in this whole area is selling tea? And it really just comes down to this idea of trust. Where I'll get into this a little later. Maybe I'm getting ahead of myself, but maybe this episode will be a little more free form. Because when you're buying Dragonwell tea, there are a few things to really keep in mind if you're really assessing, is this the real deal? The first thing to really consider is the price. If it's legitimately Westlake Dragonwell from the core region, there's a certain price tag that's unavoidable. And so you won't find authentic tea from that region for less than this amount of money, right? And if you find a tea that's less than that, it's probably extra regional. It's probably fake. There's probably something wrong with it. And so really, that's the first red flag when you're out sourcing tea. And I was there in some of the tea houses, just kind of eavesdropping on conversations. And it's really funny when people don't know tea. This region is famous for just traveling. And so there are a lot of Chinese people that'll travel through China, visit the cool places, and they'll come to the Dragonwell village, and then they'll try and bargain and get a good deal on the tea, but they're only buying 50 grams. And so it's they want to buy this tea, it's 50 grams, and the price they get, it's $2 for the gram. And they're like, well, that's a little expensive. Do you have anything cheaper? And they're like, the farmers, the makers are like, yes, we do. And then they give them cheaper tea. And it's the thing here, it's not a switcheroo. It's you asked for cheaper tea, and so the farmer gave you cheaper tea. It's not like you're going to get the same quality tea for cheaper just because you asked. The only way to do that is to buy in quantity, to buy the entire yield. And so really the only true discounts that a lot of farmers will give you is if you buy in quantity. It's the wholesale kind of prices. Usually they won't just give you the same tea for cheaper because you asked. And so I threw out that number $2 a gram, $1,000 for the pound. This is kind of what you're looking at that ballpark range for handmade tea from Shifeng Longjing, handmade tea from the Dragonwell village, from the Mandrui Long, White Crane Peak. And so when you're keeping this price tag in mind and you see a tea that costs, a fraction of that, and they say it's the same thing, you immediately think, okay, this is probably not right. I should probably get out of here. If they're going to sell me this cheap tea, they're probably not, the trustworthy source that I want. Another way to tell if you're getting the authentic Dragonwell is to kind of realize the amount of harvesting that the factory can produce. A lot of these regions in the Westlake area, they don't have huge plantations, right? It's a household with, a few, maybe an acre of tea bushes, maybe more if they're grouped together in a loose cooperative structure. as a result, a lot of them can't give you multiple kilograms of tea all at once, especially very early in the season, in the Mingqian season. Maybe later in the year they can. And so one thing I realized this year, when, harvests were really late, people were just doing the toadsai. Toadsai is like that very first flush. Just the buds, maybe one bud, one leaf, that kind of thing. You only get that harvest like a few days out of the year. And so when I go there and I know that people are just finishing up their toadsai, and somebody is offering me a huge amount of Mingqian teas that the leaf size is essentially too large for what we're being harvested right now, I'm like, okay, this is potentially last year's tea that they've re-roasted. And again, why would they do this? Because there's a tea shortage. Because they need to make, X amount of money in the Mingqian season, and they can't harvest that much tea. And so some of these places on like the main stretch at least were re-roasting last year's tea, like just throwing it back in the wok, freshening it up. And so you look at it, it looks good, you smell it, it smells really fresh, like they just made it because they just re-roasted it. And so there's a lot of kind of tricky things you have to be aware of when you're sourcing these kinds of teas. And so I mentioned, pay attention to the price tag, pay attention to the time of year and the amount of teas that they can produce. That's why I always ask questions about how big is your farm, how much tea do you guys typically produce. These kinds of questions help me realize what's feasible for them. And again, the problem with some of these ideas is the price can be faked. It's very easy to price a tea above what it costs. Because again, if you're looking at the price tag as a defining characteristic of the type of tea, it's easy to put it in that price range. Another reason Dragonwell green tea is difficult to source is that it's a really, really popular tea. It has a huge domestic market. It's one of the most famous Chinese teas here in China. And the people that are making it here are like little kings on their thrones. You go to them, you ask them to buy their tea, they say yes or they say no. And I'll give you an example of my old source, or, my current source still, 9 Trees. When I tried to, schedule an appointment to meet with them, hang out with them, they were like, okay, yeah, here's my schedule, and their schedule is totally full of people coming to visit, shooting videos, shooting promos, doing advertisements, doing the live streams. And my friend Shan Shan, she's like, I have time Wednesday morning, if that's okay with you. And so I'm there Monday and Tuesday, and she's totally, totally booked up. And even so, walking by the street, you don't very rarely get waved into little production studios. Usually, especially when tea is short and the Mingqian demand is high, they're not trying to get new customers. They're trying to fulfill orders for existing customers. And so there's this kind of disconnect where it's you're kind of, when you're sourcing this tea, you're trying to get in there. You're trying to make the connections. You're trying to beg them to sell you their tea. And so it kind of flips the idea of sourcing tea. You go to Yunnan and somebody is like, wow, this is amazing. You came all the way here. Please, let me treat you like royalty. Let me drive you here, treat you to this food, treat you to this food. You can buy whatever you want. It's so great to see you. Here in Hangzhou, you walk by, you say hello, they kind of look at you like, hello, and they don't offer you inside. They don't offer you to eat dinner with them. They're too busy for it. And it kind of makes sense, you're visiting them during their busiest time and whatnot. And it does remind me of last year. I think I mentioned this in the Dragonwell episode last year. Zhang Hailang, he was telling my tea master, he's like, I haven't been posting anything on social media. I haven't been advertising my teas. What's the point of, doing anything like that when I can't even fulfill the orders I have? And so a lot of these makers, last year, this year, and you know what? I would probably venture the guess that this is not uncommon to be overbooked, to have too many orders and not enough tea, and then that's why it really keeps rolling over and getting more and more popular. But last year, Zhang Hailang was like, yeah, I don't even have tea to fulfill the orders I have now. And so this is why it's like when you walk by a studio, they're not waving you in. They're not like, hey, come buy our tea. Like, we need people to buy our tea. They don't need any more customers, essentially. So that said, I have that really nice connection, Zhang Hailong, Shan Shan, Mr. Li. Mr. Li, in Chinese I call him like General Li, Li Zong. But he's just a nice guy. I think he's the financial backer of Nine Trees. And he just really loves camping. He loves traveling. He really, really loves the tea. And in Chinese, they they have this saying, or not saying, but a word called zhuangbi. Zhuangbi means like pretentious. And really, if you're selling the height of tea in China, you have to be pretentious about it. You know, you have to put on the nice circle glasses, the really like austere studio spaces. You have to make it look like an elegant thing, and this guy is the king of that. But he's also a really nice guy. But anyways, I came back to Hangzhou because they just created, my city has the new stop on the high-speed rail. And so to get from Yangzhou to Hangzhou now, those are two different cities, Yangzhou with a Y, Hangzhou with an H, it takes me about 3 hours by high-speed train. Really convenient. And so I was like, you know what? We've been selling a whole lot of the Mingqian Dragonwell. I want to go there and just check in on it and see how everything is. And so I book the train. I get into Hangzhou. And I get into Hangzhou Monday night, and it starts raining. As I'm in the cab from the train station out into the West Lake. And it's about a 45 minute cab ride from like the heart of the city into the West Lake area. So even similar to Suzhou with the Bilochun, like Bilochun is, you know, from the Suzhou city, the West Lake Dragonwell is even closer to the heart of the city than the Suzhou Bilochun is. Interesting point there. However, it takes me 45 minutes to get out there, and it starts to rain. Luckily, my hotel is, you know, in Upper Mandrelong. Last year, I stayed in Lower Mandrelong. And Mandrelong is like on the slopes of the Baihefeng, the White Crane Peak. And I'll talk a little bit more about its precise location in order to orient you guys and give you an understanding of this area of the West Lake. But for now, I get into my hotel right as it really starts to rain. It's nighttime now. It's about 6 p.m. So things are getting dark. I have enough time to get an umbrella, go out to the tea fields, and take a few pictures. And it is surprising because the people are still picking teas, which you really don't want to be picking teas in the rain. I've mentioned this in previous episodes and stuff like that. There's this idea of the water flavor, like the shui wei, which is the yu shui, the rain. If there's too much rain in the tea when you're picking and processing it, it'll just taste a little watery. However, the day I got in there on Monday, it was sunny all day and just started raining in the evening. And so I think what I was seeing is like the tail end of the picking. However, the leaves were wet, and so they would need a lot of attention when they're drying and withering and stuff like that. But anyways, I was able to take some photos, and I was walking around through like the small alleyways behind the mountains, behind the tea fields and stuff like that. The rain is coming down, and I'm just really, despite the rain, I'm really enjoying it because it reminds me of a lot of old short stories I've read, like Chinese short stories, Japanese short stories of just like things happening in heavy rain. And for me, that really like sets a beautiful scene. And so I see all of the water kind of rushing down the alleyways because we are still on like the slopes of a mountain. And so I just like, I have big boots on, so it's not a concern for me. And I just see it all rushing down. I have the umbrella. I'm taking some videos. I'm getting that nice tip tap of the rain in the audio. So I'm living the dream here. And as I walk by, I kind of linger and see one. It's kind of like a garage doors open, and people are making tea inside. And I'm looking at them, taking some photos, and like one of the ladies looks up. She's like, "Oh, you're back?" And I'm like, "I'm back. What do you mean I'm back?" She's like, "You were here last year, right?" And I was like, "I don't think I was here last year, but I was in Hangzhou." She's like, "Where have I seen you before? You look so familiar." And to be fair, it's like, you know, I'm a foreigner in China. I don't see a lot of other foreigners here in the Westlake area sourcing teas. And so, yeah, I'm like, you probably did see me. And then we're trying to figure out where. And she's like, "Oh, you were at Tang Xiaojun's. And I was like, oh yeah, Tang Xiaojun's. And she was like, I was there when you came in, with your tea master and stuff like that. And I was like, oh, okay, that's why you look familiar as well. And so she's like, okay, if you want, come in, we can drink some tea. My daughter's upstairs. She'll brew you some tea. And so I go up there, and this is when I meet my new contact, Xiao Wang. So Xiao Wang, funnily enough, looks exactly like her mother, who looks familiar to me. And so I feel like I already know this person. And then her mother says like, oh, I met this foreigner last year. He was at Tang Xiaojun's. And if you remember the Dragonwell episode, Tang Xiaojun, Tang Little Army, and then his brother Tang Hejun, Tang Crane Gentleman. And so these are the two head makers in the Manjulong region that make the Bai Hefeng Westlake tea. And so in this region, they are local celebrities. People talk about them. People know their teas. They have big studios with a bunch of apprentices. And so immediately, it's kind of a pretty high recommendation, right? To be like, oh, like not only do you know Dragonwell, but you've drank some of the best Dragonwell in this region. And so, Little Wong is asking me, she was like, oh, do you like Tang Xiaojun's teas? And I was like, actually, I like his brother's Tang Hejun's teas. And she laughs because this is kind of like, it's very typical to kind of compare the two. Some people don't want to compare the two, but they're very, very clearly different. Like Tang Xiaojun, Little Army, his teas are perfect. Really, really beautifully shaped. There's a little more power to them, a little more force in like the making of it, a little more heat in the tea themselves, a little more time in the wok. Tang Hejun, the Crane Gentleman, his teas are a little more wild, like a little more, he doesn't care so much about the shape. He does less time in the wok. And so his teas have a lot of this orchid fragrance, this really, really incredible floral fragrance, where Tang Xiaojun, his teas are a little more of that fire, a little bit more of that roasted chestnut kind of like, it also still has a lot of flower to it, but they're kind of two elements of the same thing. If you think of the Chinese ideology, this is yin and yang, right? And so it's so cool that they're brothers making the same famous tea in the same region. One makes a more yang style tea and one makes a more yin style tea. And then I mentioned to Xiao Wang, I was like, I really like Tang Hejun's, and she immediately understands. She was immediately like, oh, you like the more delicately processed, the floral fragrance. Well, that's kind of what I like as well. And that's the teas that we make as well. And so she immediately gets some of her whole handmade stuff and brews it up for me. And so after she brews it up, I'm just like, oh my God, this is exactly what I love in Longjing tea. This has that wild orchid fragrance, and I know this because I just bought a wild orchid plant, and I was smelling the fragrance, and it's uncanny. It's a beautiful tea, and I was like, wow, how much is this? And she was like, oh, this? I don't have stock of this. This is the Totsai that I made. I have maybe 20 more grams of it. And so for me, this is another, good sign where she's brewing me tea that she likes, that she really wants to share. She's like, this is tea that you can't buy, that is too expensive to buy. There's not enough quantity to buy. And so all we can do is share it. And I'm just like, it's tea that's too good to sell. You can only give it freely. And I'm just like, this is a beautiful kind of moment here. And I do kind of, she's like, oh, have you bought tea from the Longjing region? Did you buy any Tang Hejun's? And I was like, actually, I bought some from Jiushu. And she's like, oh, Zhang Hailang, his stuff is a little more fiery. I'm surprised you like it so much. And I was like, this is really cool, where it's just like everyone is in this region knows each other. They know the other makers, and they know their subtle styles, right? So the Nine Trees, their stuff will have a little more time in the wok. And let me back up and kind of explain this idea of more fire, less fire. The woks here are electric woks. And so they're very, very heavily controlled, where it's like you have the kill green temperature and then you have the drying temperature. The difference is the hui guo. And so after you kill the green, you start shaping it, you'll put it in the wok for 15, 20, 25 minutes, and then you let it out and you let it cool. And you kind of sift it, and get the broken leaves out. And then you return it to the wok, and you keep doing this. And so the more fire it has, is it spends more time in the wok. you hui guo it more times. You put it back in the wok and kind of add a little more heat to it. And so the difference here is not necessarily one of temperature, but it's one of heat absorption over time. And this is a very Chinese, if you get into the TCM of it, this is a very powerful Chinese concept where it's like this tea has more fire. This tea has more yang energy to it. And so that's where it's like these are literally the yang, yin and yang teas here. And so I find that I really like the yin style teas more than the yang style teas. Zhang Hailong is also rather famous for doing his chai shao wok stuff. And the chai shao wok stuff is, instead of using an electric heated wok, he uses actual a wood burning wok, which you see in the Biluochuan region and is the more traditional style of doing it in Hangzhou. However, very, very, very few people are doing the chai shao wok. And so he has that fame for doing it. And as a result, a lot of people attribute his teas to having that really fiery, that live fire flavor to them. And I'll tell you later about, sampling some of those teas and what it did to my mouth, where it's really cool, but at the same time, in the Chinese TCM, these teas are very shanghuo. It creates a little more heat in your body, and so you can't drink too much of them. Otherwise, you'll kind of have this discomfort. Anyways, so Little Wang is telling me about these different makers, their different styles, and then where she fits into it. And so if you look at not necessarily lineages, but she would be more akin to Tang Hedrun, where Zhou Shu, Nine Trees, and Zhang Hailong are more akin to Tang Shaodrun. And so one has more fire, one is more yang, and one is more delicate, more floral, and more yin. One interesting thing about this idea of lineages, what I saw in Hangzhou, this time around, what's really starting to make sense to me is this idea of studio setups. And I see this all the time in Chaozhou. Not on the Dansong oolong production, but in the Chaozhou teapot making. So the teapot makers will have studios, they'll have teachers and masters, and then they'll have apprentices. And those apprentices eventually start making enough teapots and they grow up and they start their own studio. That's essentially what's happening here in the Longjing region. We see this master and apprentice kind of situation, this relationship going on, and people carrying on different styles of tea making, different lineages. And so Tang Shaodrun, he has several apprentices, some mature apprentices that will probably one day create their own studios and then boast that they were the Tang Shaodrun's apprentice. And this really makes sense here because you have so much going on in such a small region. You have so many people making teas. There's so much competition here, tea tastings and everything. It's really densely populated, and you have to make a name for yourself somehow. And also, making this tea handmade, the Longjing tea, is very time consumptive. A real true master cannot make very many pounds of this tea a day. And the market demand is astronomically high for it. There's so many people who want handmade Dragonwell tea, but if you have a single master making it, it's going to take a really long time. I remember seeing not Tang Shaodrun, I remember seeing Zhang Hailong with his chai shao wok, and chai shao just means wood-fired, right? And so his wood-fired wok, and he's just working on maybe 500 grams of tea throughout the entire night. And so it's taken him essentially from 8 p.m. until well past midnight just to make 500 grams of this tea. And he sells this tea for 59,000 renminbi, which is about 8.25K, like 8,250 US dollars for this 500 grams, because he spent, 6-8 hours on it, because it also involves picking, withering, and then frying it in the wok, killing the green, returning it to the wok, sifting, returning it to the wok, sifting. Here, the last time I was in Hangzhou just recently, Little Wang, she was up until 8 a.m. some days, where she was really just working all through the night, because they pick tea during the morning, in the afternoon, they let it wither, and then usually towards evening, they'll start making the tea. And so this is a very time-consumptive process, and the prices can get astronomically high. One workaround for this is to hire apprentices. And so it's not just you making the tea, it's, you and then six other people that you're teaching. And so the idea here is like a tea from a studio, even if it's wholly handmade, unless it's explicitly stated that it's made by this master, and then the price tag is going to be crazy. It's probably from the apprentices and then pin paid. Pin pay is a term I saw first in white tea when they're pressing tea cakes. It means blending, mixing different lots together. And so this idea is that a lot of different makers in a single studio will be making a tea to their studio specifications, and then they'll take all that tea and blend it together. And so you're not getting a single maker's production. Sometimes you're not even getting a single day's production, because we're talking about Mingqian teas here, and the quantity is very little sometimes on some days. Also, you can't really be very selective on the weather. You're always at the weather's whim. And so I remember in Jiushu seeing the tags in the production line. They would have notes about the tea. They would have what was the weather like when it was picked. Was it picked in the morning? Was it picked in the afternoon? What time did it start withering? And they'll take all of these things into consideration, and then they'll blend the teas in order to make a more wholesome tea that fits with their studio taste. And so maybe you'll have, 25% of stuff that was picked in perfect weather, and then 75% of stuff that was picked in like a cloudy day. Maybe even 5% picked during the rain, because you have to make use of everything, especially in the Mingqian tea season. And I remember asking Shan, I was like, do you guys pin pay? And she's like, yeah, of course. Everyone does. You have to. And so this made me think of the idea in like Yunnan, when you're sourcing the pu'er tea and you can get into the danju. Danju is single tree productions. Because a bush in the Dragonwell region can, maybe only produce a couple pounds of tea in a year, in a season, you can't really do single bush productions here reasonably. And so what you're looking at more, if you're trying to get exclusive with it, you would look at single producer, a single person making this tea from start to finish. You would look at a single day, because sometimes it's not even a single day. Or you would look at a single region on the mountain, right? And so Jiushu, they do this. They have different regions. Like one is the Mandrelong, and the Mandrelong is just anything within this region of their tea bushes. Another one is the White Crane Peak, the Bai He Feng, and this is what I usually buy. And this is the stuff that is explicitly from the Bai He Feng region, which is, right by the Shifeng, right by the Longjing Sun, before you get over into the Running Tiger Spring. And these teas are really, really sweet. This is the stuff Tong Hejun and Tong Shaojun pick and make. And so this is my favorite Longjing tea, my favorite Dragonwell. And I'll tell you a little bit about how I wandered through the different villages sampling them, and I really realized I like the Bai He Feng. And so Jiushu, they have these kind of markers. You can even get a little more specific. There's like a New Arbay, or Nubei Shan, which is like a really specific region within the crest of mountains and stuff. And so they're doing this, and the price ranges all have different values and whatnot. And so for me, I find the White Crane Peak is better enough to justify the price jump. But like the Nubei Shan, I'm like, okay, like it's really good, but it's 3 or 4 times the price. I don't know if it's worth it. Now, speaking of prices real quick, I'll just give you some bookends to really understand like how much these teas cost in this region. So when I get out there in Mingqian and I'm walking around the tea mountains by myself, the prices I'm usually seeing, depending on if it's half handmade, whole handmade, depending on the regions, it's usually about 3,000 renminbi all the way up to, 59,000. But more usually, its upper range is usually around 10,000 renminbi. So 3,000 to 10,000. I think in US dollars, that would be close to something like $450 to $1,000 for the pound. And that's the wholesale price you get on the mountain from the makers themselves. That's before any type of retail going in there. And that's just the average standard. And so like I said, when I see a price in the mountains that's cheaper than that, I have serious suspicions. I'm like, no way. And also, it's like I'm not going there to buy the cheapest tea. Like, if I'm going to buy select Mingqian Longjing tea, I'm going to buy something that is worth the price. And so, Zhang Hailong, his entirely Chai Shao Walk stuff, right? That retails for about $8,500 for the 500 grams. It's something I would never buy. It's something that is just simply not worth that price. I mean, it's worth quite a bit, but that's a little excessive even for me. The way a lot of this tea is sold, it's sold in increments, maybe 50 grams at a time, if it's that high. A lot of times, these teas, though, similar to the stuff that Little Wong gave me, that she just didn't have stock of, that she said it was like too expensive and she didn't make enough, these are gift teas. These are teas that are invaluable, that are beyond price. And so when I visited Shanshan, she was busy the first 2 days, and so she was a little embarrassed. She was like, if you come Wednesday morning, I'll brew you up some of the chai shao stuff that Zhang Hailong just made. So I'm like, great. So we get there, she takes it out, we're drinking it, and it is something else. It really is astronomical. However, one thing that I've gotten more and more sensitive to, and this haunts me while I'm tasting my dan songs, the freshly roasted dan songs, I am sensitive to this heat that's found in the tea, and I get very shanghuo very easily. And so, how does shanghuo represent itself or present itself? For me and Shanshan said she was getting, cold sores, slight pimples on her face and stuff because of the shanghuo, because of these really, really hot teas. She's drinking a lot of teas that are just fresh out of the wok. And I remember the first time I really associated this idea of shanghuo, this idea of discomfort from freshly made teas, was in the Bilochun region a few years ago, when Master Shen was making his Bilochun fresh out of the wok, and then I grabbed some fresh off the pile that I'm going to buy, and I start brewing it, and he's like, it's really not good to brew it. You should let it sit for a few days, and so like air out some of that heat. I'm like, oh, whatever, and I brew it up in the cup, and I'm like, wow, it tastes so different. A lot of the sweetnesses were muted. It had a really serious like minerality on the tongue, and it started making my mouth tingle. And what was interesting about this is it kept making my mouth tingle for a very long time, like for 3, 4, 5 hours. And eventually I started getting really, really thirsty. And I've been drinking, and this is interesting. So I've been drinking a lot of freshly made Longjing teas the past week or so. Every day drinking 8, 9, 10 different types of these freshly made Longjings that were just made like yesterday, the day before yesterday, today even. And then I'm realizing like I'm so thirsty at the end of the day, and my mouth it's thick, my tongue feels thick, my mouth is tingling, and it's this mild discomfort that I'm now associating with, the teas were too fresh, the teas were too hot, the teas had too much heat in them. And this is what just bogs me down when I'm drinking the dan songs. Like when the makers send me 20 different dan songs that they had just finished charcoal roasting that week, like that's a different type of heat than lightly pan searing it in a wok. This is actually adding a lot of heat to it. And so while a lot of people think they would love to drink the tea as fresh as possible, there are still limits to that. Like I would like to drink these Longjing teas at least a week after they're made, not the day they're made. For the Dansong oolongs, give them 2 months. Like, I'm not even kidding. Somebody just posted that they were drinking the 2021 Gardenia fragrance, and I was like, whoa, how is that? It must be really mellow now. And he's like, I love aged Dansong, mildly aged Dansong. He's like, I don't even like fresh stuff anymore. And I'm like, you know what? I might be feeling that. Wen Zitong kind of converted me, because at that point I was really not looking forward to drinking fresh Dansong oolongs, but the stuff he sent me, I enjoyed all of them right away. So really just, maybe it's, my taste is getting more sensitive. As I mentioned, I'm a little more sensitive to this shanghuo idea. But yeah, with drinking that chai shao stuff, that really made it very clear to me that it is something that's going on in that tea, and it would probably be better to let it sit for a few days. So getting back chronologically to my first arrival, this time in Hangzhou, it's raining. I suddenly meet Little Wang's mother, And then she takes me up, and little Wong brews that really incredible handmade tea once she knows that I've, been initiated into the Tang Hedrun, Tang Shaodrun kind of scene. And we're drinking. I'm like, this is just amazing. I came here. I've been in Hangzhou Westlake for like 2 hours. Like, I didn't really expect to be drinking such phenomenal tea so quickly. And she's like, it's the ke yu bu ke qiu. I was like, ke yu bu ke qiu. What does that mean? It's like an idiom that says things that can be found only by chance and not when they're sought. And for me, I'm like, that sums it up. Like, things that can be found only by chance and you can't find it when you're seeking it. That is literally my sourcing motif. This is my motto. This is my ideology behind it. And it's incredibly Taoistic in its ideas, where it's like you can only find the punchline to a joke when you're not looking for it. When you're trying to understand why the joke is funny, it loses all funny. Like when you're trying to understand how a butterfly flies and you're tearing its wings off, you're breaking the whole equation here. It also reminds me of that delicate situation of falling asleep. Like, the more you try to fall asleep, the harder it becomes. Like, to really fall asleep, you have to totally just give it up, and then you surrender into the sleep. This finding only by chance and not by seeking, this is the heart of serendipity. I mean, it reminds me of the Tao Te Ching. In chapter 38, it says, "Great virtue is not virtue. Therefore, it has virtue. Low virtue tries to be virtuous, and thus has no virtue." And it's this like really funny thing where it's like, the more you try and be good, the less good you actually are. You need to be good without trying to be good. You need to be virtuous without trying to be virtuous. Only then can you truly be virtuous. If you do something because you know it's a good thing, and because you're thinking like, oh, I'll do this and then that's a good thing and I'll get a reward for it or something like that, you have this ulterior motive. And so you must do it without thinking about it. And this is, again, like that heart of serendipity that only when you give it up can you find it. When you try and find it, it eludes you, like grasping at water or grasping at smoke. Again, this is a huge motif in like Taoist poetry and Buddhist poetry and all of the Zens and stuff like that. Like, the more you try and find it, the less you can actually find it. It's like we're all looking for the ground that we're walking on. And if you hear me talk about luck, and if you remember my experiences in the last episode talking about like Lin Song and stuff, this is my sourcing methodology where it's like I only want it when it comes naturally. I don't want it to be forced, and I'm very selective about it. And it's like, maybe I'm being too altruistic, but it has been working out okay for me so far. And for me, it's just that truth of life that I really, every time it happens to me, it reaffirms this experience of living, this transient experience of all your joys are temporary and they'll leave you. And the more you cling to those, the more you'll suffer. This reminds me, I met the head of the Buddhist community here in Yangzhou. He's up in the Guanyin Temple. His name is Fa Rong. And the first time I met him, he gave me some tea and we just talked. And he explained to me all about the Dharma. And he has this really great personality where he's laughing, he's giggling, he's a very open, friendly guy. And then he's telling me like the heart of everything is emptiness. Everything that changes has an empty nature. The more you perceive the emptiness within all things, the more you can overcome their loss. The more you forget that things are empty inside, the more you cause yourself suffering by trying to keep it the way it is, because everything wants to change. Everything will change. And your resistance to change is what gives you that suffering. Anyways. Moral of the story here is that I love the chai shao, wood-fired wok stuff made by Zhang Hailang the day after he makes it. The highest quality stuff I could never afford. I love this 108 Yaoling Ba, wholly handmade Mingqian Tuo Cai that little Wang makes 2 days after she makes it. But I can't always find these. I can't buy them, even if I wanted to. They are just fruits of this life that spontaneously arise, that can only be found when not seeking them. And that's part of their joy. Now, I think I have a little enough time for one more story, and it is a story about seeking. So it's pretty ironic, but it's a story about seeking someone in the tea mountains. You might know him if you're familiar with the tea scene. His name is Jürgen, and Jürgen runs the tea addicts or the tea dealer in Hamburg, Germany. It's a retail shop that does really fine Chinese teas, and they've been doing it, or actually, they do teas from all around the world, and they've been doing it since 2017, 1 year before we started One River Tea. And so I've always kind of looked up to them because their ethics and their model and their sourcing style, it's very similar to the way I want to do things and that we do things. So their goal is to go to visit every farm, meet the makers, understand the process, and document everything and share this with the rest of the world. It used to be Jürgen and Stefan, but I believe Stefan just recently left. And so now it's just Jürgen. And Jürgen reached out to me actually because he had, somebody in his tea community that put him in touch with the Tea Soup podcast, and he listened to it and was likewise inspired, which, this is the beautiful thing of fourth level of luck and coming full circle, where it's like I'm finally giving back to the people that gave to me. He reached out to me and said, I will be in China in March doing some sourcing. If we can meet up at any point, that would be really great. And so in truth, this trip to Hangzhou was really about kind of meeting Jürgen. And so, of course, I had a lot of other things to do, and I actually made a really beautiful new contact when I was there. But my goal was really just to meet this guy who's, I've looked up to for quite a while now, because I love the idea of a retail shop, and I really wanted to, meet more people in the tea scene, because I live here in China and I'm very isolated from a lot of the tea world. So it's always good to just branch out and meet more people. So the next day, after I drink some of Little Wong's teas, and I'm like, this is so good, I'm going to come back tomorrow, I'll drink more teas, I'm very happy. And she's like, what are you going to do tomorrow? I'm like, tomorrow I'll probably just walk over to Shifeng. She's like, okay. And she draws me a little bit of a map. And she's like, check out this mountain. This slope here is famous for this style of tea. This slope is famous for this style of tea. And so really, my goal for the next day was to walk over to the Shifeng mountain slope and then get a taste for the other regions on the way. And I was talking to Jürgen. Jürgen was in Hangzhou City, and he's like, I'll get up to the mountains tomorrow. And it's like, okay, maybe we can meet somewhere in the mountains. For me, this is always, poetically ideal for me, like finding somebody on the mountains, meeting a planned meeting in the mountains for the tea mountains. Like, for me, this is my bread and butter, if you know. I always want to be an ancient poet from like 700s, and this is as close as I can get. And I'll tell you the story soon. So the next day I get up and I start walking essentially up more mountains. So Mandrelong has two Mandrelongs. This is the village that is right by the White Crane Peak range, the slopes. It has Lower Mandrelong and Upper Mandrelong. I'm already living in Upper Mandrelong, but now what I need to do is to get to Shifeng, I have to go up the mountain even more, and eventually at the peak, the ridge of the mountain, again, forgive these sayings, they're not really peaky mountains, they're just kind of like rolling ridges of not even mountains, I would say like rolling hills. Anyways, to get to the Shifeng, I have to go up one ridge and then back down it. And so going up from Mandrelong Upper, which is already pretty high, you have to leave the White Crane slopes, and then you get into the, what is it called? The Wongjia Shan. And so Wongjia Shan is very close to the Dragonwell village, and it's actually one of the highest points in the Westlake area. And so their teas are usually also pretty highly sought. My taste on their teas, I had some of them. It has a really good mouthfeel, really thick, but usually it's a little too nutty, a little too roasted, not roasted, but a little too much heat in their processing up on that mountain. Their teas, they do really well, but they don't have that flower fragrance, that special something that I'm always looking for in the White Crane Peak. And so walk up there, I sample some teas. I'm not really confident if it's this year's teas or not. It's kind of a miss. I actually end up getting into a tea house, getting into a production place, drinking some teas, talking to them. I have a video of it I might post later. And then eventually I was not impressed with the teas they gave me, and so I just walked out. I was like, okay, like thank you, like I'm not really impressed with it. Which it's kind of awkward, like when I'm already in the mountains and I'm already like saying it's difficult to get in there and drink the teas, but they were wanting, like it wasn't a cheap cup of tea, like if I wanted a sample, it was going to cost me at least $50 just for a sample. And so I was like, okay, like I'm gonna walk out of here. I told them I didn't want to buy anything, and I end up leaving the Wangjiashan, and then I go down the next slope. Down the next slope hits right into the Longjing Sun, the Longjing village. This is usually where, I think this is where the actual Longjing is, the Dragonwell is. But really what's interesting here is seeing it geographically, where this is kind of a lower region as far as altitude goes. It's not high altitude. The Wangjiashan was high altitude. The Baihefeng, semi-long high altitude. But the Longjing Sun is really low. You get some fields and stuff like that. It's nothing like the Meijia Wu, but it is kind of a little more flat. And then you don't get more mountains until you hit the Shifeng range. And again, Shifeng ridge, not range. Because the Shifeng is really also not very high. I say that, but I lost my breath when I was climbing up it. But I had some time in Shifeng as well, and I drank some of their teas. These teas I liked a little more. They felt like they had a little more life to them. They still had more of that body than I was having in the Baihefeng. So Baihefeng is a little more in the nose and the upper palate, and then these Shifeng teas were a little more on the tongue and the back of the throat, as far as like weight goes and the tasting differences. I still wasn't getting a whole lot of orchid or floral fragrances from these, and so I did buy a sample, but I wasn't really sold on them. I think I know what style of Longjing I like most. However, I didn't exhaustively source the Shifeng teas. Anyways, I drop a pin in Shifeng and tell Jorgen, like, I'll be up here around noon if you want to meet up here, and then we can go get some lunch. And so I get up to the right of to the west of the point I dropped. And I'm waiting for him, and he's like, I think I'm here. And he sends me the location. He's right to the left of the point I dropped. And on the map, it looks like we're looking at each other. And I'm like, how is this even possible? Because we can do this real-time location sharing, so I can see his GPS point, and he can see mine. And we're literally on right on the other side of like this Shifeng pavilion. And I look over and there's this cusp of trees, and I'm like, okay, you have to be on the other side of trees. But but I want to make sure. And so what I do is I cup my hands to my mouth, and I do what I've always wanted to do in the mountains when I'm looking for somebody, and I shout his name as loud as I can to echo off the mountains, and I say, Jorgen! And then he's like, messages me, he's like, yeah, I heard that. I'm like, cool. I felt like an ancient poet at that time, so... The only way to get to him, though, is cutting through some of these rows of tea plants. And so I end up getting pretty muddy and eventually get to him and meet him. And so it was really great to actually see him. He's very much in my style, where he has his like big bag on, he has his camera out, he has a lot of gear and stuff. He's in the fields to take photos, he's in the fields to do business, which is, exactly what I'm doing as well. And so we walk together down the mountain, get some lunch, and walk back up to essentially Wangjiashan. In that time doing, I'm kind of talking to him and learning a little more about him. And I really like, just this person who Jorgen is. I mean, I don't have a lot of stereotypes as far as like for people, like for Germans or something like that, because he is from Germany. But I've heard other people, and like even like the Xiao Wang, who eventually met him, she's like, oh, Germans are so serious, but you're not so serious. And I'm like, oh, I guess that's true. Like, he's a very friendly guy. He smiles a whole lot. He's relatively open. He's kind. And yeah, we connected very well. And what's really cool about this is if you're doing this kind of like tea business for 6, 7 years, 8, 9 years, like the amount of people that really have the same experiences as you gets smaller and smaller and smaller. And so we have a ton of common ground to talk about. I'm learning things from him already because this is the end of his sourcing trip. This is what, March 25th, March 26th. And so he's been in China for 26 days. And I start listening to all the things that he's sourcing. He also went to Anhua, which hopefully will come out with an Anhua episode next month because Alex and Xiaoyan went there. And I'm learning all these cool things about the teas he found, the places he really likes, the things he's suggesting. And, I'm learning a bit about Jorgen, the person, and the tea dealers and the tea addicts and the whole idea behind the mission. And I'm really taken by it. And I throw out the idea, like, you know what, like, we won't get this chance very often. Why don't we do would you mind if I interview you? And so he accepts. And so what we do is we plan for this interview. I have a hotel or an hostel, something with like a rooftop balcony. And so we get up there, we set up the cameras, and we do a video podcast. There is a lot of wind in the audio and a lot of planes passing by, and it does get dark. And my manual exposure setting makes the camera get darker and darker. So I'll see what I can do to kind of, in post, to kind of fix that up and post it. But it was I really enjoyed that interview. We talked about some funny instances we had on the way back to my hotel. There was a really funny, sketchy sourcing instance that happened. But we did get some more of the Wangjiashan Longjing. And, he was pretty taken by it. He was like, this tea tastes very different from a lot of the other Longjings. And I was like, you know what? I really want to show you the person I met last night because her teas are really magnificent. And I'm really excited to buy some from her. And so after we shoot the interview, we walk up the mountain a little further to Little Wong's place. And I introduce Jorgen. Jorgen gets some nice photos of them making tea in the basement. And then we go up and start drinking tea. And again, she pulls out some really nice whole handmade 108 cultivar stuff. And we're brewing it. And Jorgen is like looking at the tea like he doesn't understand it. He's just like, what is it? It doesn't taste like Dragonwell. He's like, I don't really understand how people can drink this tea and then think it is Dragonwell because it is so totally different. It has that floral orchid. It doesn't have that green bean. It doesn't have that roasted chestnut. He's thinking like, if I bring this back to Germany, I think it'll really confuse a lot of people because he's been working on getting a little sampler of some of the Longjing teas, the Dragonwell teas he's sourced, and he wants to kind of open up this like kind of not blind box, but a tasting session with them. And he's drinking these teas. He's like, this would be the crowning jewel. Like this would be something else. And so I'm just really happy because Little Wong is also really excited. This is the first time she's sold her tea to foreigners. This is the first time her tea that she knows has gone overseas. And so she's really excited. She's young. She is probably like 20, no, she's 30. She told me she was 30, maybe 29 though. Chinese ages, they always add a year. But yeah, she says her husband works in the Zhejiang University. And they have a big tea scene there. They always get together, drink tea late at night, talk about tea. And then Jorgen starts talking about, the Friday tea sessions they do at Tea Dealer and how there's just this rich community of people that just love to drink tea and talk about tea. And I'm sitting there feeling connected in like a tea community for one of the first times in a very long time. Feeling like these are like, two of my friends talking, drinking tea together, sharing it with me. And I'm kind of realizing that, I am rather isolated here in China doing this thing, and the Tea Soup podcast has helped me connect, but it was a really, really pleasant experience. And, what made me very happy is hearing from Xiao Wang. Like the next day I went back to Yangzhou, and then Xiao Wang's like, oh, your friend Jorgen came back and bought a whole lot more tea. I'm like, that's great. I'm so happy about that because now we're both buying tea from this very small production house. He's bringing it all the way to Germany. I'm sending it out from Yangzhou, from China Direct. And it's so cool that more people will get to experience this, what we both thought was some of the best tea we had in the Hangzhou region. All right, so that brings this rather random, rambling episode of Tea Soup to a close. I was just so excited about everything I learned, my experiences in Hangzhou with the Dragonwell. I wanted to get it out before I forgot anything, and while it was all still fresh in my mind, and my tongue is still tingling from that really, really shanghuo, freshly made teas. Again, it was really interesting seeing all of these pieces of information kind of click into place. Meanwhile, I'm in my studio right now looking at all of my clothes, looking at my 2 cameras, my drone, my new microphones, my Rode lavalier mics. I'm getting ready tomorrow to leave on my 30-day trip through China. I'll go to Fuding first, then I'll go to Linsang, I'll go to Xishuangbanna, maybe I'll go to Chengdu, I'll go back to Hubei where we're renting our own piece of land, meet up with Alex, hopefully record some more Tea Soup episodes about what he's getting up to there, because he's doing so much and he just doesn't post about it, he doesn't share it on social media, and so I have to kind of pull out that information from him. Hopefully, I think we have 2 woofers there right now out in Hubei. Maybe I can get an interview with them, see what it's like working on the farm out there, and see what we can do, because there's also supposedly a group of old trees that people forgot about that are the Dabai Hao cultivar that were planted in the 80s and on just this inaccessible side of the mountain. And hopefully we can cut a path there and make our first batch of white tea. After that, I'll go down to Chaozhou, see my friends in the studios, Master Kumin, Zhang Yin Chao, who makes those really, really thin kettles available on Tao Teaware. And then I'll also go up in the mountains and see Wen Zitong again, Wudong mountain stuff. So anyways, I got a really busy week ahead. I gotta get out of here and get packed, and until next time, guys, brew happy.